Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Topiary. Topiary is actually in the same program that I'm in. So before I really start my presentation, I want to give you a short description of what actually happened, just to give you some context, since probably most of you haven't heard about this disaster, and then I'll begin with my actual presentation. So on November 5th, 2015, which is about a year and a half ago, the foundations of an iron ore tailings dam from an iron ore open pit mining operation in Bento Rodrigues, Brazil, cracked, and 60 million cubic meters of toxic iron waste rushed down the Rio Doce, the Sweet River. Iron mining needs a lot of water in order to process the iron. Water which then becomes highly contaminated with toxic heavy metals. And so basically, if you have a mine, there's all these tailing ponds that get built around it to hold this waste water. I'm just gonna keep going. The show goes on. Okay, got it. So what happens is that in some, it depends on the geography, but some of these tailing ponds actually need dams in order to contain them. And so it was one of these dams that cracked. And it was an avalanche of red mud, basically, reaching the nearest town, Bento Rodrigues, in less than 10 minutes, and then making a 17-day march downriver. The river is about 850 kilometers long, which is 530 miles for you Americans, and until it basically reached the Atlantic Ocean. Killed officially, the death toll is 20 people, or 17, injured many others, and displaced thousands, not counting, of course, the impact on the environment, wildlife, microorganisms, and other non-human stories. The dam is owned by the biggest mining company in the world, Australian BHP Billington, although the local company, the kind of shell company, is called Samarco or Vale. That whole story is complicated, and I'm not going to talk about it. But Samarco, Vale, BHP kind of all stands for the same thing. In many ways, this is a classic example of a type of environmental disaster. Others call it a crime. It's sudden, it's brutish, it's toxic, it's preventable, and it's definitely man-made. So before I go on, I'd like to show you a film. Okay.
I'm getting too thick.
Okay.
5 de novembro de 2015, 36 milhões de metros cúbicos de lama, de rejeitos tóxicos, vazaram da barragem da Samarco em Mariana. O maior vazamento da história mundial da mineração. Pessoas, fauna, flora, rios, histórias perdidas. E quanto vale? Quanto vale? Tava dormindo. Cangoma me chamou. Diz: levanta, povo! Cativeiro já acabou.
I'd like to take a minute also to thank Lori and TJ for provoking really what was a year-long discussion around themes that I care deeply about, as well as inviting me to speak here, present at this conference. So we are in the middle of basically, we're filmmakers. I'm going to introduce my partner in a second, who's actually Skyping hidden in that computer over there, Lucas Benetti. But we're working on what we hope to be an semi-interactive, interactive interface. And so in kind of coming up with mock-ups for that type of interface, this is one of them, which I actually just used to organize my slides today. So this is actually, just to briefly explain, this is a picture that I took in an abandoned school in Paracatu de Baixo, which is a small town. It was the second town to be hit by the avalanche. And this school was the only building in the whole village that had 2 stories. So otherwise this would have been buried in mud. And as you can see, they must have gone to school that morning on November 5th because there's still a Red Cross the day that they crossed that day out. But it has since been totally abandoned, and most of the residents of this small town haven't returned. So also on the bottom, I was very inspired by this book called Petrochemical America. I don't know who's familiar with it. And there's these beautiful sort of workings with the shape of the river. So this is not the entire river. This is just a zoomed in part of the river. And playing with the aesthetics of the shape of the river is something that I would love to do with this interface. But I won't be talking too much about the interface today because that's really the work in progress, and more about the disaster itself, my research questions into it, and of course our filmmaking. So the interface here, the map that I'm going to show you here. So on the left, just to give you a really big, broad context example, South America, Brazil, Minas Gerais, which is a big region. And actually, Minas Gerais means general mines, which really speaks to kind of deep colonial histories that this region has gone through. And on the right is an overview of the river. And it's, I mean, whatever, we can talk about the map itself, but it's, so again, 850 kilometers from start to finish, and it ends in the Atlantic. So we spent around 2 days per locale, which prevented us from focusing and developing on specific characters, human or non-human, but instead really created, even in the kind of embedded approach of the amount of time that we had, what I argue is fragmented, but really a wider collective story. We made stories of both humans and non-humans, residents, victims, organizers, tourists, activists, poets, including ourselves as filmmakers, as well as filming with and around the river, the mud, with dogs, mules, cows, the landscape, rocks, as well as the water as its own material and the river itself. Before going, I took an excellent anthropology seminar that is taught by Nancy Chen, who's a wonderful professor here. And I think this is important to mention because it really inspired me for my approach to this project. The class was called Disasters and Resilience, and we read books on a host of different disasters, Katrina, Fukushima, Bhopal, Chernobyl. And for those of you who are working on a project about a disaster, I really recommend this because you start finding some extremely important parallels. No 2 disasters are alike. Some are natural or man-made, some others are are, tsunamis, but there are some very interesting ways that the responses by the governments or the companies, start giving you ideas for how actually common the situation of post-disaster landscapes are. So the book that actually inspired me the most was Adriana Petrina's book on Chernobyl, so that's the one on the right, called Life Exposed, Biological Citizens After Chernobyl. A small example, the famous Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. So it caused officially only 31 deaths. But of course, more than 1 million people have been affected by radiation poisoning, many dying painful deaths years later. Official accounts, so in Brazil, official accounts by BHP and the government are already telling people that the water is safe to drink, that they can go back to their normal routines, that there's no such thing as very high levels of manganese and arsenic. And so, the official death toll in this disaster is only roughly 17 people, but that death toll doesn't take into account other types of, you could call, slow suffering. What about the suffering that's in the present or in the future? So it was with this constellation of texts, ideas, and other readings that I began to think through an approach. What is suffering in a post-disaster landscape? Also, just to backtrack just a little bit, so how did I get onto this project at all? So Lucas Bonetti is a good friend of mine. He was a SocDoc alum here, social documentation, which is roughly in the same program that I'm in the PhD, there's the master's. And him and I are good friends, and he is Brazilian, and he's from Belo Horizonte, which is a big city that's about an hour and a half northwest of where this occurred, and so it hit very close to home for him, and he had a huge kind of infrastructure of support that we could plug into, though. So him and I kind of started collaborating on this project. So back to my question, what is suffering in a post-disaster landscape? Suffering, precarity, and uncertainty are deeply intertwined. Who and what is allowed to suffer? Who and what get to qualify as victim, and who defines victimhood? How is suffering defined, and by whom? Since compensation by corporations or the state is tied to the definition of victimhood or its deeper affect suffering, it's really important to notice when and how victimhood is defined and by whom. And in this case, it seems, so in my case, it seems largely defined totally unofficially. There's no official definition of it by Samarco, Vale, BHP, as they're actually the ones doling out the compensation. So of course, compensation, we're just talking about financial compensation, is totally unequally doled out. Some people are getting compensated, some are not. This is causing huge rifts in communities. Who and why is getting compensation makes no sense. But those are big questions that have been addressed before, and I'm interested in going a step further than that. So also, as you can tell, I'm concerned with questions of suffering, and I'm also concerned with how to engage with a project like this in a cinematic approach. So you're going to be sensing me kind of blending these two things together. So in tandem, how does one begin to approach this project via cinematic lens? I'm developing what I call a new methodological approach in my own work, what I call a making with, a researching and learning about the world through film in a non-anthropocentric approach. How can we take a multilinear approach, which is a term that I'm going to come back to later, to documenting a disaster such as this one? What does it mean for filmmaking to be indeterminate in structure, fragmentary in presentation, collective versus individual? And how might this methodological approach inform my research question? Living in the so-called Anthropocene, Capitalocene entails ongoing concerns with speculative futures that allow spaces for other worlds to emerge. And so taking a phenomenological approach in filmmaking is but one answer. So, enough talking for a little bit, let's turn to some clips. I'm first going to show you a model of the disaster that goes by very fast. So that's the dam. So it's not actually, there's 3 dams that are around the mine. It's not Santarambam, it's called Fundão, but it doesn't matter. They're very close together. And so when the dam broke, that's it's sped up, but it took only 10 minutes to reach Bento Rodrigues and 20 minutes to go downstream. This is actually a model that's built by a geophysicist that's actually here at UCSC.
Could you run that again?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so that's the dam, that's the water. And that's the total time, 19 minutes, 35 seconds, right?
Aqui é nossa ainda, que ela não pagou nós um centavo de nossa área aqui ainda, então é nossa ainda. Acabou tudo com menos de 10 minutos. Tudo que eu fiz com 60 anos de trabalho. O lugar que eu criei minha família, tudo foi aqui, ó. Você não quer dizer que a minha casa era aqui nesse monte de tentes aqui. Eu tinha uma venda aqui, muito grande aqui também, ó. Aqui no meio tinha uma garagem que cabia 4 carros de comprido, um atrás do outro. E do lado de lá, minha casa. Que sobrou da minha casa. Aí meu irmão morava ali, ó. Ali minha filha, e eu no meio lá, e mais uma filha ali para lá dessa casa aqui, e mais um filho para lá da outra casa lá. Praticamente aqui no Bento era uma família. Todo dia era a mesma pessoa que você via. Esse grupo aqui tinha 70 e tantas crianças. Saiu tudo assim, quando a lama já vinha ali, ó. A diretora juntou caminhando, desaparece todo mundo. Por 1 minuto. O que é 1 minuto? Matava tudo aí dentro. A gente não comprava nada. Agora foi para Mariana, tem que comprar de um tudo. E eu tinha renda aqui, uns 4 mil reais por mês. Fui para Mariana, essa máquina está me dando 1.000 e pouco lá agora. E conta de luz por nossa conta, conta de luz cara. Não vê aí falar quanto vai para o Bento Rodrigues, Novo Vento. Eu não posso considerar futuro nenhum mais para frente, por causa da minha idade, né?
But what about those who didn't lose a house, as Zé Barbosa has, or an entire community? How can a corporation compensate with money for losing a way of life? What about the Krenak, an indigenous tribe that lives off the Rio Doce, for whom the river figures prominently in their mythology? Does the Krenak mythology get to suffer? Indeed, how does one compensate for a poisoning of mythology? Sorry, slightly out of order. So I'm just going to keep it in the same order. This is actually a clip that I found of iron mining from the 1950s in Minnesota. And there's actually a similar clip that's in Portuguese, but since we're mostly an English-speaking audience, I thought I would go with this today. And I cut it down. It's used a bit ironically, but I actually think it is somewhat instructive for us to understand a little bit the processes of mining. So I'll start with this.
One shot. Many of the questions are a result of what somebody told somebody else. All the questions have answers. Answers based on the knowledge and understanding of what's going on up there on the range today to make the industry bigger than ever. Think of it. Everywhere you look, you can see for yourself why the mining industry must plan for years and years ahead. You can see it in the great Hull Rust Mahoning open pit, the largest of all the iron mines. Mining iron ore in the open pit seems like an easy job, but it isn't as easy as it appears to be. Open pit mining involves a lot of big machines to dig and process the ore, railways and ships to transport it to the nation's steel mills, and the working together of thousands of people stretched over 1,000 miles, and the spending of hundreds of millions of dollars to get the iron ore to the steel furnaces. Even an open pit mine would seem so simple. For instance, When you see a popple and pine forest up on the range, you could be seeing an iron mine, but you'd never know it until you did a lot of exploring. You first have to drill down to find out if there's ore beneath the surface. You may have to put down 100 holes or more. And if you're lucky enough to find it, then you plan how it can be mined. Then roads have to be built through the forest to bring in the equipment. Some of the machines weigh 20 tons and better. There are deep layers of sand, rock, and clay that cover the iron ore. All this must be stripped away. Miners call this waste material overburden. An underground mine reaches in many directions with a network of tunnels called drifts. The ore is scraped from the drifts into cars, carried by an underground railroad to a skip hoist, which lifts it to the surface. Most of the direct shipping ore has to be crushed. It adds to the cost of mining, but does not increase the iron content. It has to be done, however, before the ore can be used at the steel mills. And it may seem strange, but mining calls for a laundry, big washing machines to clean low-grade iron ore. Washing is the most common practice of iron ore concentrating. Low-grade material, going in at the top of the great plants, works its way down through many complicated machines. Lighter sand and impurities are carried away in moving water to leave only the good ore ready to start it on its way to the steel mills. And every care is taken to remove silt and other waste material from the water used in washing iron ore, so that clean water is returned to the lake or stream from which it was drawn.
Fala, né, o rio bom, o rio da água doce, né, de onde o índio tira comida boa, entendeu? E como você vai cantar isso hoje em dia com seu filho? A gente sempre bebeu dessa água, sempre tomou banho, sempre cozinhou, nunca matou a gente a água do rio. É tristeza pra gente viver na beira do rio, falar moro na beira do rio e não tem como a gente vir dentro do rio. Aqui tinha o pacumã, o cascudo viola, o cascudo laje, tinha a curimba, o piau, tucunaré, sabe? E não existe mais nada, acabou tudo. A gente está passando dificuldade em questão de água para o boi beber, porque caminhão-pipa não dá conta de trazer água para boi. E é difícil você viver dependendo de outras pessoas. Nossa vida, nossa mãe, nosso pai, isso aqui. E é isso aí, ó, e eles acham que isso não incomoda não, entendeu? Passa dentro de terra indígena, é válido, não adianta eles verem, essa marca, não. Ali, ó, tá passando ali, ó, né, na ferrovia, é Vale do Rio Doce, então. Só para quem vive essa vida, essa situação, entendeu? Muitos lá fora julgam a gente. Esses índios querem dinheiro. E dinheiro nenhum paga isso que eles tiraram da gente, não. Existe dinheiro que paga esse rio. Eles têm que dar pra gente o que a gente quer agora. De imediato, que é a nossa água de volta. Porque hoje, se você quer peixe, você tem que comprar. Não vai lá dentro, lá em casa tem peixe, mas porque eu comprei o peixe. Coisa que não precisava fazer isso. E vão tentando viver, né? Estão tentando viver. Porque a vida da gente não pode parar, só que a gente ainda espera um dia eles devolver esse rio pra gente. Oatu minharé, oatu minharé, oatu boquinhauê, o burumango trehé.
In essence, I wanted to explore the impossibility of quantifying suffering of compensating it, the impossibility of accounting for suffering, the impossibility of making a logistics for suffering. How do we, in turn, how do you represent suffering? Is it even possible? This is where I believe a different multi-species filmic approach, which doesn't only privilege yet neither discounts the human, is essential to explore beyond tropes of victimhood and human-oriented suffering, which are definitely not invalid, but they aren't sufficient. While the human narratives help people relate to the suffering, I also want to expand the ways we're used to thinking about suffering in deeper, broader ways. I'm not sure there's any way to ever recover from a disaster of this magnitude. There's only a going forward, a learning to live with or a die with in this new system of relations, this new ecosystem, this new set of toxins. In exploring what a non-anthropocentric filmic approach looks like in tandem with a multilinear method, I've tried to learn to film with instead of film at. I'm using the term multilinear as opposed to non-linear, which implies an inherent binary, right? Linear, non-linear. I'm not against linearity. I'm against having a single narrative versus multiple narratives going in multiple directions and maybe all at the same time. There is no whole story to this disaster. There is no one story or one character which can represent it. So taking a fragmentary, indeterminate approach to answer my initial question, what is suffering in a post-disaster landscape, opens up the possibility of knowing other worlds, even creating a new way of knowing the world, instead of a narrow, single representation from one human character or ideology. Sorry. I was especially interested in deconstructing linear narratives, as I've mentioned, and making a project that would embed indeterminacy, the instability of the river, the instability of suffering, of compensation, and all the river's post-disaster inhabitants, human or non-human, in its very fabric. So I will leave you with one final clip. I skipped over a bunch because I'm out of time. This Prezi is actually, by the way, public, so you can all access it and watch all the things that I skipped over if you want to rewatch something. All right, so here's the final clip. Thank you so much.